conversations. But it was the best morning walks because of the area where we were in Calcutta. This was Prabhupada's hometown.
It was a little bewildering. There was all these neon flowers, neon decorations, plastic flowers, lots of electrical cords twangled and dangled. I remember at one point the devotion that was there. It hit me. What was going on was, pure devotion to these deities. And that this family had been absorbed in devotion to these deities for centuries. And that Prabhupada was absorbed in devotion for these deities. So that suddenly, the picture changed. And then I remember they sat us down and they were serving us prasad. It was a beautiful Bengali feast. And it was served, on banana leaves with such respect for Srila Prabhupada. And the respect from Prabhupada was transferred to us. They were Prabhupada would use the word aristocratic, but they were very aristocratic. And their affection to Srila Prabhupada was definitely apparent, as was his towards them.
At the Radha Govinda temple, Prabhupada's childhood temple in North Calcutta, Prabhupada did a series of lectures in the evening. The Mullik family, which was the family he was related to, who owned the temple, and one of the great Zamindar families of Bengal during the time of the British Raj, they lived across the street, and of course Prabhupada was raised in their house. They all came to the program. The whole atmosphere was like Prabhupada was the grandfather or the great-grandfather, and they were so respectful. The way they came in, their heads were always covered, the way the women bowed down, the men were nicely dressed and standing in the background, and everyone was very attentive to Prabhupada because he was their relative who was now world famous. Prabhupada's mood at this meeting was very familial. He was very gentle with everyone. It was just like family. There was a very loving side to the whole relationship between him and the Mullik family. And of course, those deities, Radha Govinda, were Prabhupada's childhood deities. This was the temple where he played as a child, where he had his Rath Yatra festival, and he worshipped these beautiful deities that they have there still. Radha Govinda, they're the deities that Prabhupada said called him back to India. In the 60s, he went back to India, he said, Radha Govinda have called me back. And that's when he started all his major Indian preaching.
Prabhupada came to Calcutta with Pradyumna in 1973, April, and Pradyumna came up to me and said, how would you like to come with Prabhupada and type Chaitanya Charitamrita? He says, okay, tomorrow we're going to Mayapur, so you have to learn how to read Bengali and then you can come with Prabhupada. I said, okay, no problem. So he gave me a Bengali book, I learned how to read Bengali, and I was off with Prabhupada the next day. Because we never thought anything was impossible. That if Prabhupada wanted us to do something, then impossible is a word in the Fool's Dictionary. So yeah, no problem. I learned to read Bengali, and I get to go with Prabhupada.
In Calcutta, it was a challenging place for us. Something about the temple, and at least at one period, everyone was sick. Everybody had dysentery, and the service, there wasn't enough people to do the basic service. So it was a challenge. And Bhanu Swami was there. And Bhanu Swami, as I remember, is a Naishtika Brahmachari. And through all of this, he never got sick. He never lost his focus. He remained active, and when others were down in their attitude, consciousness, he was never affected by it. And at one point, he's the only person who was well and up serving. Prabhupada made note one day. And he said, just see, he said, this is the value of brahmacharya. said because he is brahmachari, he is able to circumvent all the challenges of the world and continue steady in his service. This is the value of brahmacharya.
I get to have a private darshan of Srila Prabhupada. Of course, his servant was in the room, and myself and Prabhupada. When I first came before him, with what I thought was just like this huge life-ending problem, my whole consciousness absorbed in being anxiety about this problem. All of a sudden, when I got in there, the whole problem just like shrunk down to the size of the water and the hoof print of a calf. This huge unsolvable anxiety just became insignificant. And there I was like totally embarrassed. All of a sudden it didn't seem like something I should bother Prabhupada with, and I was so embarrassed. But here I am, I had disturbed him. And at that time, Prabhupada communicated something to me. You've probably heard from other devotees how sometimes Prabhupada would communicate without speaking. Prabhupada became a mirror, and I think that's a guru's function, to be like a mirror to the disciple. He was like a mirror. He was showing me my spiritual situation. And I had this like really esoteric, like internal vision, like for a few seconds of myself being this brilliant diamond-like spiritual spark within my heart, but I was covered over with just like mountains and heaps of dirt. And I also had a vision of Srila Prabhupada sitting there, the same brilliant spiritual spark, only completely clear of any covering. And he communicated to me with that vision that I was just like him, but I was covered, and that all I needed to do was to follow his instructions and I would become completely uncovered like him. And that was such an intense realization. And I thought, oh, how can I bring up my petty, mundane problem? But like I said, after I'd gone and disturbed and he was sitting there expectantly, then I did. I blurted it out. The most significant thing about that whole experience was that like internal mirror-like vision that he gave me of myself and himself.
Winter of 1973, Vishnujana Swami's bus had burned down somewhere in America, and while Karanda and the BBT were building him a new bus, he came to sail down the Ganges and do Harinam Sankirtan and Prasadam and distribution, and he had a slideshow to show these villages. And Vishnujana was amazing, doing kirtan through the villages. I mean, people were asking us to take their children with us, and they were just in shock. And we'd have a program every night with a big slideshow. And show them London Rath Yatra and San Francisco Rath Yatra. They were blown away that, their Hinduism was actually, spreading all over the world, because we were the first Western Hindus they'd ever seen. And it wasn't just that we were a handful, we represented this movement with temples and festivals all over the world. So, of course, who's the person responsible for all this is Prabhupada. The villagers were just enormously impressed. Anyway, we sailed down the Ganges for 40 days and nights, and we got stopped in northern Bengal by a huge dam called Farakka Barrage. So then we took trucks down to Calcutta, where we met Prabhupada. So we had some kind of, little camera with us, but somebody had a shaky hand. It all came out looking like ghostly images, so we didn't have anything to show Prabhupada. But when we were reporting in the room about it, Vishnujana Swami said that we had distributed 500 sets of japa beads. And Prabhupada looked very concerned, said, "You cannot do that. Now they think you are their guru." So he was a little upset that we didn't know these subtleties of Indian culture, that if you give someone beads and tell them to chant Hare Krishna, you've just given them Harinam initiation, and that's how they see it. So I think there must be a lot of villages along the Ganges where they have this memory of this bronze god from the West who looked like Lord Chaitanya and gave them initiation.
Srila Prabhupada, one time, he singled me out in one of the darshans. He said to me, "Oh, my sister tells me you speak Bhagavatam very nicely." And so when he said that, I didn't know what to say, because I never spoke Bhagavatam, what to speak of nicely. And so I didn't know, I was just completely bewildered and puzzled, why he said that. But then it was in Calcutta that I had been reading Krishna book in front of Pishima, because it was Janmashtami in 1972. And what we had to do, all the devotees were reading Krishna book from morning till night. And so when it was my turn to read, I was reading Raslila. And she was my only audience. There were hardly any people then. There was nobody in the temple in Calcutta those days. So she was about the only one sitting in front of me, and I was reading in English, and she didn't know a word of English. But I was being real dramatic, Krishna left the gopis, and they were crying, and then she was crying and crying and crying, although she didn't know any English. So she understood the mood of it. And then she must have told Prabhupada that I speak Bhagavatam. But then now, 30 years later, I thought about what Prabhupada said. And in Prabhupada's lifetime, I never spoke Bhagavatam, and even for 27 years, since when I was a devotee, I never spoke Bhagavatam. But now I'm speaking Bhagavatam. Just this year, when I was speaking Bhagavatam in VIG, it struck me that Prabhupada's words came true. Even though I didn't understand what is he talking about? But then I thought, wow, pure devotee's words must be true, that it has to happen. And even though I had no plan of ever speaking Bhagavatam, but it happened anyway, by Krishna's arrangement.
We were in Prabhupada's room in Calcutta, and Nanda Kumar brought in a letter for him to sign. And Prabhupada looked at the letter, 2-page letter, looked it over, and then grabbed the pen and goes, A, and then C, and then this big Bhakti Vedanta, and then big capital Swami. And there was a life member there, and I was there looking at this, and we kind of looked at each other, when we saw the signature. And Prabhupada noticed it, and he looked at the life member and he said, yes. When I was at Scottish Churches College in Calcutta, my professor witnessed my signature also, and he said, that is a royal signature.
Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare.
So we went to greet Srila Prabhupada at the airport, and this is, of course, the very, very first time I ever saw him. So I was a little anxious, and I remember they rolled out a long red carpet, and I remember my first impression. For some reason, I had expected him to be very tall. I don't know why. And I remember thinking, oh, he's so short. But there was something so very regal about his carriage. And then he went to sit down on the dais. They had actually brought a little sort of wooden dais for him to sit on because there was going to be an interview. It was a television interview. And first there was, of course, the kirtan, and then everyone sat down. And of course, all the people in the airport in the background wondering, what's going on here? And so I was just mesmerized watching him. It was like watching a performance for me, solo performance on the stage. And he sat down with the greatest of elegancy and ease. And someone offered him a silver goblet of water. And I remember him holding it up, and the stream of water flowed like a fountain right in his mouth. And it was just so elegant. And I just thought, wow. Being in the theater profession for some years, it was like, boy, that person really has a lot of grace to be able to do that in front of all these people, just everybody's eyes on him, with not even a string of nervousness or tension or anything like that. And then they offered him a plate of fruit, and he very delicately just picked up a piece of fruit and just sort of popped it in his mouth and sat there and chewed it, and everyone was watching him. And And no discomfort, no nervousness or anxiety. He just finished eating that little piece of fruit, and then he was looking around, one after the other, at the faces, very peacefully and quietly, really looking, taking all the time that he wanted to. I was just, from a material standpoint, completely impressed.
One time, I purposefully brought Prabhupada's vases of flowers back to his altar late because I knew that he would be arriving. So I was the only one left in his quarters, and I had dared to do that because I thought that was a good chance for me to meet Prabhupada face to face. So I came late with the flowers, returning them to his altar just as he was walking into his sitting room. So I placed them on the altar and then paid my obeisances. And Srila Prabhupada was still standing. He hadn't sat down behind his desk, and he said, "And what is your name?" And I told him my name was Hari Puja, and that I had just gotten second initiation, and I thanked him. And he shook his head like he did side to side, and he said, "Thank you." And then I left. I was very happy that I'd got to talk to Srila Prabhupada face to face. The next day in his lecture, I can't remember it, but the idea was that Prabhupada had mentioned that even a sincere flower girl can make progress and go back to Gladhead. So of course I was thinking that he was recognizing me.
I had just graduated from Yale University. I'd been living in the temple for 3 weeks, but I was always afraid that my ex-fiancée, who I had just ended the engagement a few weeks ago by slipping away to live in the temple, I was always afraid she'd come to the temple and drag me out. So I prayed to Radha Govinda, Sri Sri Radha Govinda, "Please, Krishna, get me out of this one, and I promise you never again." A few weeks later, Prabhupada came, and I was sitting in front of him as he gave a Sunday feast lecture. And Prabhupada began to roar with great transcendental strength that if you're optimistic about material life, you're an animal. If you're a human being, you must be pessimistic. While he was roaring like that, I felt this tap on my shoulder. And I looked, there she was right behind me. So all this is going on right in front of Prabhupada. So I kind of looked at her, and Prabhupada continued to roar. And I didn't bat an eye. I just turned right back and looked at Prabhupada, and I could see out of the corner of my eye that she was about to burst out crying in the middle of the temple room, like, "What's going on here? Here's my dearly beloved, you know, and now he doesn't even blink an eye at me. He's just totally absorbed in this person." So she left, and Prabhupada went on to explain with less fire. Material life, yes, everything's pessimistic, but in Krishna consciousness, everything is optimistic. So after that, I remember the kirtan we had for the deities, and I remember dancing in ecstasy, thanking Krishna, "I'm free, I'm free, Prabhupada did it, I'm free, I'm free."
One time I was on a walk with Prabhupada in Brooklyn, and it was one of those walks where Prabhupada would drive to his destination and then walk and then come back. And as we were coming around the corner, just in front of the temple, Prabhupada saw that there was a boy who was mailing a letter, but he was a small boy, and so he couldn't reach the box, and his father was picking him up, or the boy was dropping the letter in the box. And Prabhupada saw this, and he just became absorbed in seeing it. Of course, how long does it take to mail a letter? It's only a few moments, but Prabhupada just became absorbed, and again, it seemed like it was so much time. His eyes became very wide and became sparkly, and he seemed just as if he were remembering something, and I was thinking, what is Prabhupada thinking of? You know, something from his childhood or what? And the scene ended, and Prabhupada said, the little boy, by his own strength, he cannot do. But the affectionate father, when he helps, then it is possible.
We were going to do a performance for him the first evening of Krishna Kidnaps Rukmini. But I really felt that he could see into me. There was nothing that I could hide. Then I was thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be playing the part of Princess Rukmini, who's an expansion of the goddess of fortune, and oh, it's ridiculous. What am I doing? You know, it's just going to be a farce. But anyway, it was planned, and you know, the show must go on. So there I was, and the scene opens with myself sitting on the floor by myself, writing the letter to Krishna. And I could feel my right knee beginning to shake out of nervousness. And then I remembered something my director said. He said, whatever comes up for you, just use it in the part. Find some way to integrate it into the role, you know. And then I just realized, well, she probably was in a very anxious state. I mean, here she was to be married to somebody she didn't want to be married to, and she was totally anxious. And also I noticed as my eyes went up, even though you don't really look at anybody, you still sort of have a feeling. And as my eyes passed Srila Prabhupada sitting there and moved up, just this ease came over me. It was like he put this blessing on me or something. And I just forgot everything, and I just became Rukmini. And was able to just play with total abandon, just totally get into the part. And then we finished, and there was grand applause and everything, and we went down to the dressing room, and I was completely drenched with sweat. And we were waiting, just taking our makeup off and so forth, and then Shruti Kirti came in and started telling us everything that Prabhupada said. And I was real excited and everything. He said, Prabhupada said, this is better than reading my books. It's better than reading my books because it sticks in the mind, because you have a vision. And he said, seeing these is like windows to the spiritual world. So people just don't hear it, but they actually have an experience. And then I got the wonderful compliment when he said, Rukmini, she was the best. And I thought, wow, after all that anxiety I went through, and then he was actually pleased. And then, of course, there was a little part of me that thought, well, he's just saying that because he knows I need to hear it. But then I also understood when you use whatever talent you have in Krishna's service, that is the best. So it didn't matter whatever I was thinking. And he actually wanted us to go with him and travel with him all over the world. I think his next destination was Africa. He wanted to take us with him, and he said there should always be, you know, kirtan, lecture, performance, and prasad. It just didn't work out at that time. But I realized the importance of cultural events in the presentation of Krishna consciousness that Prabhupada really wanted.
And Srila Prabhupada was working on one of the chapter, or some of the chapters of Chaitanya Charitamrita. We had a recording device. It was big. I mean, it was like, you know, several feet wide. So Srila Prabhupada would dictate Chaitanya Charitamrita, and as soon as he was finished, Pradyumna would bring it up to me, and I would immediately transcribe it using this big contraption.